You've had their formal introductions, but you'll see their nameplates go up as well. As I'd mentioned, we're really taking on this question, this big question of our age, which is the path to inclusive growth. It was taken on from the bottom up in a way. You can see the enthusiasm and optimism of our technologists who are on stage and business people. That's a bottom up perspective. What about when we think about this journey from stagnation to rejuvenation that we all want the world to go on at this difficult juncture? What is the role of top-down solutions, of governance, of policies, of cities? Here, I'm delighted to have three people with experience who are steeped in a life of practical experience in this area. Maybe I will start with Liam Maxwell. Liam, you're the digital czar for the British government, and yet you wear your power and your mandate lightly. Can you tell us a little bit about thinking about the right role for policy, for government, as it comes to the digital divide and dealing with new technologies like AI that are clearly double-edged swords? They have the power to empower, as we heard from our first panelists, but equally, as a skeptical audience responded with their vote, but also with their questions. There's a call for a framework and for government to give us a new kind of social contract.
Yeah, so thanks, Vijay. The fundamental reform that we've enacted in the UK government over the last 5 years really has been to put the citizen and change the relationship between the citizen and the state, building services around the user and building services that work for people rather than working for the state. And I can't overestimate the cultural change that involves. I think on AI...
just as by way of preface, not everyone may be familiar with the UK's IT history, but there is an infamous history of outsourcing enormous multi-billion-pound contracts and having them go wrong with the NHS, for example, and so on with the health information technologies. So you and the team that work with you have fundamentally turned that approach on its head to think differently about it. So that there was a disaster to which you were responding with a new way of thinking about things.
Yeah, that was the fundamental change. And it also led to enormous savings and a different way of engaging with the state. I think just to address your issue with AI head on, as a state, one of the things we have to try and understand as a government is we need to have the trust of our citizens working with us. And if I give you some examples of the way that we would look at the issues of artificial intelligence in government, and we're doing quite a lot of work with the British Academy and the Royal Society on this, is the approach we took to human fertilization and embryology in the 80s was extremely consultative and meant that we could start to think about a very different form of science at the time, in a much more open and effective way, and the consultation and the Warnock report and the principles upon which that work was based was engaging with the citizen closely. When you look at the way that genetically modified food was brought into Europe and the UK, it was not done on that basis. It was a similar fundamental change. And of course, it didn't land at all. It was very, very unpopular in certain groups. And the argument for it, in many cases, was lost. And it was lost because we didn't have that consultative approach. So in terms of AI and the use of it in public services or in public sector decisions or the decisions by companies, we're taking very much the first route for that.
Well, there is another argument, though, with GMOs, isn't there, that could be an analogy with AI if it's not done properly. Part of the reason I've argued on the pages of The Economist that GMOs did not take off in many parts of the world, although they have done so in significant parts of the world, the initial benefits were largely for producers. The consumers couldn't immediately see the benefits, so they were promised benefits eventually. And so why should people take on what seems to be strange new technology that doesn't have any obvious benefits to the punter, but enriches the companies that were involved in the process? And so that seemed a poor way to sell in a new, very promising technology.
Exactly.
And that might be happening with AI, where I'm not seeing the benefits necessarily yet. Perhaps companies need to do a better job of persuading me in seeing the benefits.
And not just persuading you, but also defining their own narrative. Because if you don't define yourself, as people know, if you don't define yourself, others will define you. And that's the situation we want.
Before we get too deeply into our session, I'm being chastised by some of you on the website for not having asked a poll question to this audience, to this panelists. So let me do what I did the first time in setting up the technology panel with our governance panel. I will ask you to do a forced vote. You must vote yes or no in favor or against the following statement. Over the next 20 years, I believe that innovative government and good governance will dramatically improve the situation of inclusive growth. In other words, this is a question of on your faith in the capacity for government to innovate and to governance. So hands up, how many of you agree that in the 20-year time frame that not that you want, to be clear, but that you will see inclusive growth as a result of good governance and innovations? Okay, how many of you do not think so? How many of you remain skeptical about that point? Okay, my reading is it was sort of 70-30 in favor of the motion, which may reflect one of two things. The fact that many of you here are either current or former government officials or policymakers. And secondly, that we happen to be in Singapore, which is a particularly well-governed city. So perhaps there's a bit of the local hometown champion at work here. If we held this in a different part of the world, perhaps the answer would be different. But anyway, so now you know which way, you have the wind at your back, folks, unlike our poor friends from the technology sector that had to endure the headwinds. Let's push on, though. On this question, how can we think about smarter models of governance, better policies, and again, to try to take on this question of inclusive growth, which has become not only a problem in developed economies, but also increasingly in developing economies. The attention has come much stronger. Perhaps if I can turn to you, Ishur, can you give us, you've written a lot about and done research on the role of cities and urbanization as an engine for growth of prosperity. But of course, there remain challenges of the urban-rural divide. What do you think of the movement towards smart cities, one of the great popular buzzwords of the day? Singapore aspires to be a smart city, lots of technologies. There are driverless cars driving around in some parts of Singapore at the moment. What is can this really be a big part of the solution? Or do you offer us some caveats or lessons learned?
I think there's no doubt that technology can play an important role through e-governance, in grievance redressal, even in setting up infrastructure and all that. But our experience in India over the last 10 to 12 years has shown that technology without better governance, without better accountability, without empowerment of cities, will not do the last mile. So you may set up fancy infrastructure with technology, but it will not lead to better public service delivery. And why I say we have seen with experience is that when we've tried it in the last 10, 12 years, it's only in a few states which actually provided the right enabling environment for that technology to lead to better public service delivery through better governance, that we could see the results. Elsewhere, it was infrastructure, but not better public service delivery.
Do you have, I mean, you make a profound point, of course, it's the context. There's no silver bullet from even the best of technologies. What works? In your experience, in your academic research, and what you see in cities, what is something that cities can do that would work?
Well, first of all, in India, one of the major requirements is for our cities to be empowered. Our cities are not financially autonomous.
So financial
and
empowerment is one thing.
even if they want to charge user fee to cover their costs, they have to go to a higher level of government to get the permission to do so. So if you don't have a revenue model for service delivery, you can't even attract private sector to bring finance and deliver it. So for us, the first and most important thing is to really empower our cities through guaranteed transfers or ability, giving them the power to mobilize resources, charge user fee to cover costs, When all of that is done, then, of course, technology is a great enabler in delivering services.
That cuts a little bit to the empowerment point. We heard a little bit the same point made earlier about how digital technology is getting closer to the user or to the citizen. Both of these things relate to something that is tangential but important, which is transparency.
Yes.
Can you pick up on this point about the importance of transparency and how it can be enabled through the right source of technology?
Absolutely, because what we have done in India is that we have transferred constitutionally through an amendment, we have transferred accountability to city government, but we have not given them financial autonomy. As a result, they are accountable, so they have to do things transparently. If they don't, they can be questioned because they are close to where the action is, but they do not have the power to deliver because they don't have the wherewithal to deliver. They don't have the finances or functionaries. Even the functionaries of municipal governments are often paid by the state government. So, in that situation, transparency and accountability is right there around the corner, but you don't have a financing mechanism which can allow you to try alternative ways of delivering public services.
Great, thank you. Richard, you have been vocal. You were previously head of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. Now you're in the private sector. But no one has accused you of being shy in commenting on public policy failings.
I was trained by Charlene Barshevsky, so that's why.
Right, there we go. And we've heard about some of the challenges of governance. In the U.S., they might be called unfunded mandates, for example, where Congress tells states to do things but then doesn't give them enough money or any money, right, which is the example from the Indian case. But there's a broader problem, isn't there? It's not just that specific example. Can you talk about policy and what you think is going wrong? And again, I want to connect it to our conversation about inequality and inclusive growth, which is the engine of our discussion today. What do you think has gone wrong with the way the public policy is made and monetary policy, which is your wheelhouse?
Well, in terms of federal public policy, everything's dependent on, so far, the last 2 decades, on monetary policy. There was a comment made earlier on Jacob Frankel's session. He talked about excessive monetary creation, and somebody referred to the markets as the akin to drunken sailors. I was in the Navy. That's an insult to drunken sailors, because I think things are, if anything, out of control. They've exacerbated inequality. The rich have gotten richer. Charlene Barshevsky made the point earlier that those that were suffering the most from the downturn never really recovered. The reason for that is because of fiscal policy and regulatory policy. Monetary policy provides the mean to float the boat, but fiscal policy has to give you some of the rules of the road and give you some guidance. We have not had a budget in the United States for the last 15 years. And in 6 out of the last 15 years, they've been 3-month budgets. You can't plan around that. You can't guide around that. So I think fiscal policy is critical at the federal level. And secondly, regulatory policy. Right now, as many of you probably know, we're going through a discussion about the acquisition of Whole Foods by Amazon. The current version of antitrust is truly driven by, will it drive prices higher or lower? The justification is to increase consumer preference, but at the same time drive prices lower. That's not the way the antitrust laws were originally conceived. They were to prevent concentration. So it really is a question of how you regulate, how you guide, how you use fiscal policy at the federal level. The state and local level, I would say the biggest issue we have in the United States and our major Achilles tendon is we have an inferior primary and secondary education system. You want to drive equality. You want to take advantage of technology rather than be abused by technology. You have to create the skill sets. Yes. And we have undermined that by starving in math and science and in general education our primary and secondary system. So I would say...
Let's hold up on the education point because I want to make that a broader discussion. But on your very specific comments about public policy, you rightly pointed out the short-termism and venality perhaps of American federal politics. Mm-hmm. Who's doing it better? Do you see a place that... or another way of doing things that you could point to that would give us some cheer? Because we're all getting a little depressed at this point.
Well, I wouldn't get depressed because I think the private sector then substitutes. Let me give you an example. If you want to reserve a restaurant table in the United States now, you don't go through the process of telephoning things. You can do it through the net. If you want to figure out how you get from point A to point B by car, you go to your handset, or you go to your computer, or you go to the set in your automobile to figure out where the blockages are, and you reroute your travel. What's coming up next is first responders, which I think is where that's a public sector function. But the government has now let out to a company called AT&T, Truth in Advertising, on their board, where we will be able to improve that system, cover 98.2% of the U.S. population, because the government failed to provide a modernity of first responders. And this will be done now through a single company that will improve the efficiency, get away from walkie-talkies and just visual, but rather provide artificial intelligence to make it much more efficient in responding to a crisis. So I'm not so pessimistic. The government has failed. The private sector is picking its place. In terms of an alternative, and there are drawbacks, which other panels have talked about here, I think China has done a remarkable job, really. Even though they have stepped back, as was mentioned earlier, under Xi Jinping, to a little bit more protectionist, keeping technology out, but moving China from made in China to innovate in China. And what they're doing actually is providing the kind of guidance. I understand their logic. Internally, their government providing to the benefit of their companies, and using government to incent and direct what is better for what they believe is the best for the Chinese people. So I think that's an alternative model.
Point about short-termism. Of course, the Chinese famously have 5-year plans.
That's right.
And they think about the long term.
But, you know, the criticism of the private sector so far on the panels is short-termism. The real criticism should be of the U.S. government, which is fiscal policy, short-termism.
Right. Now, I'm getting numerous votes on a particular topic that's trending in our room. The audience would like to discuss downsides of AI. I'm being told by our powers that be. For example, cybersecurity. Now, since we do have some people in the room here on stage who have something to say about this, what should be the right way for governments to handle the downsides of AI? We heard from the technologists in the first half. Let me ask the three of you, maybe starting with Liam. What do you think? You're clearly a techno enthusiast, but at the same time, you have a special role in government, also to think about the public welfare, not just short-term corporate profits. What's the right way to handle the downsides?
I think the thing we learned most of all after years, as you explained, of big bang IT projects where you would pull a lever and put an enormous solution in place, which almost always fail to hit the mark. A much more incremental approach to design and deployment of solutions is something we have is now part of our DNA in government in moving this forward. And I think the use of AI in that space is going to make that even more important, because a government could actually lose control of its processes quite easily. And if you lose control of your processes, you lose control of the trust. And if you lose your public trust, then you're in a much, much more difficult situation. So it's actually itself it offers itself to be a regulatory brake against doing rash things. And I think a lot of the concern that people have about AI, I may be very wrong actually on this, but the concern that I've had expressed to me is in government taking rash decisions or making massive changes too quickly without evidence to back it up.
So you make an excellent case, and you've led by example on this, about how to make sure that the bits of AI as it relates to the government's own workings and public data are safeguarded. In a way, you're saying, move cautiously, move incrementally, and
move iteratively is the really key thing. Move iteratively, as in small steps, and learn from the mistakes, and you will make mistakes.
Right. However, if we ask a broader question, which is what I'm hearing from the room through the electronic system, is that's fine within your moat, which is an important moat because you have the public trust. But we have technology companies that are speeding far ahead, and they have master plans, and they're inventing evolutionary technologies that most of us in this room can't even understand, let alone the person wielding the pen in the bureaucrat's chair. How should we think in a longer-term way? What is the right way for society, with government as our place where we convene, to think about the ethical dilemmas, the dangers that might come from very intelligent, very rapidly advancing technology companies, whom today are branded as the malefactors of our age, to quote the Gilded Era?
So I think you will have seen in the Queen's speech after the election a special reference to a digital charter, which we're putting together in the UK at the moment, which is to create a much more sustainable and engaged relationship, particularly with the tech companies, in the way that we behave and the way that they behave. But remember also the limitation here for us is, as a nation state, we are a certain size. These companies are dealing with customers all the way around the world, and in many cases in a similar way all the way around the world. So it's much more an influencing and we're in a much more influencing role, and I think the role and the power of the state is limited in that sense, actually.
We saw a backlash in India against Facebook.
But I just want to make one point, which I've been wanting to make since the beginning. I just want to provide an additional perspective on inequality. Since the morning we've been talking of inequality, but there is one respect in which global inequality has actually declined. If you look at developed countries as a group and developing countries as a group, and you look at how growth has proceeded in these two groups, and you were to construct a global inequality index, global inequality has unambiguously declined. And I think we should not fight shy of that. We must recognize that.
It's actually more, in absolute numbers, more people have been lifted out of absolute poverty in our lifetimes.
Exactly.
You're absolutely right.
And in the past, for a long time, the focus was on reducing poverty. And inequality was something we could manage. Even the World Bank talked about just getting absolute poverty to go down. Now, the SDGs, among the 17 SDGs, you have for the first time one sustainable development goal, which is to reduce inequality. And the answer to reduce inequality in developing countries, really, if you're going to have rapid growth, growth is unequalizing. So you have to have employment-intensive growth, which means the quality of growth has to be such which emphasizes labor-intensive industries. And it's not just a matter of giving targeted, palliatives to take care of the bottom 10%, 20%, 30%, but it has to be mainstreamed, just as sustainability has to be mainstreamed into our growth processes. So I think these are the core issues for developing countries, and these other issues are okay. This is relevant for the globalized part of our economy and probably very relevant for us to sustain rapid growth, but the core issues are what I've just laid out.
I think that's a powerful point that you make. We have someone in the audience that I think knows a little bit about this, whom you know. I believe Montek Singh Ahluwalia is here. Can we get a microphone to him? Unless he's... there he is. Okay, please get a microphone to the gentleman. Many of you will know he's a former deputy chair of the Indian Planning Commission, long-serving, and played an important role in conceiving and popularizing and indeed pushing the idea of inclusive growth. If I can ask you, sir, please stand up. Let's have a good look at your visage. There we go.
Can I be heard? Yeah.
You have many accomplishments to your name. I would say...
No, you did a pretty good job.
Perhaps the greatest is persuading this brilliant woman to marry you, of course. But among your professional accomplishments, is it fair to say that in the many years you've worked on this hands-on, there was a feeling that tackling poverty was a priority over tackling inequality, and that has perhaps reversed now?
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, internationally, probably in the 70s, the World Bank, as Isha said, regarded the reduction or elimination of poverty as its sole objective. Now, there were a lot of poor people then, so clearly that's important. And I think what they were trying to convey is that, there is a trade-off in the sense you could have a low-growth scenario which doesn't have any increase in inequality, but doesn't do very much for the poor either. Or you could have a high-growth scenario where the growth is actually inclusive, and you get a big impact on poverty. But maybe in the rest of the distribution, the rich do better than, let's say, the middle. So the general assumption was a little bit of increase in inequality need not be sneered at as long as it's giving you a big reduction in poverty. Now, as the scale of absolute poverty goes down, obviously the other side of the coin becomes important, And it was never thought, by the way, that extreme inequality is acceptable. I mean, most of the concern today is not that inequality is increasing, but you're seeing extreme inequality in the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, which is what the debate is about. And that is obviously going to create lack of cohesion and disrupt the social compact.
Just to press with you on this very specifically, the pie has grown. The theory was the pie grows, the rich get richer, but in fact there are enough gains that disperse so that everyone gets better off. The story hasn't quite unfolded that way, as we know. What is the blame that technology should take? We're here to talk a little bit about the role of technology versus, say, fiscal policy, tax redistribution policies. Where does the solution lie? Do you buy the techno-utopians who are on stage before that say that their solutions can help us tackle this problem?
Well, you know, history doesn't provide any guide that you should be holding back technology. I mean, it does suggest that you ought to be managing it, you should offset its negative impact. So there's no question that when it comes to extreme inequality, I mean, the solutions lie in fiscal, progressive taxation, better social safety nets, that kind of thing. And I think it's true that that aspect has been neglected. Because a lot of this sort of low taxes are always good for growth. There's no real evidence for that at all. So, I mean, societies should build an appropriate social safety net, an appropriate redistributive mechanism. That's what I think should be done.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me bring it back. Maybe I'll ask our man from the Fed, recently of the Fed, what do you think about the comments from the floor?
Well, I agree. You have to treat this with some kind of progressive taxation policy, but you have to create a progressive taxation policy that doesn't thwart innovation and economic growth driven by profits in the case of our system or driven by a common good. So I think that's the riddle that one has to deal with. I think the nice thing that just came forward, though, and I thank you for making this comment, is the theme that's run throughout all of this, which is free trade and progressively free trade and opening up markets, bringing China into the system, et cetera, has done more to lift us up than it has to press us down. And I think we need to re-emphasize that theme constantly. Second point, if you think of all the technophobia that one often hears about, go back and remember what happened during the Industrial Revolution. The Luddites and others tried to suppress this. Everybody felt their labor would be replaced. They would lose jobs and never recover. It didn't happen. So I think we have to be careful here. The objective of governments here should be to encourage the use of technology, primarily through the private sector, in my view, but to achieve common good.
On the point about the Luddites, and you're absolutely right. We all know our history of technology. Over time and over the long term, new technologies inevitably create more opportunities for economic growth and jobs than they've displaced. That's been true throughout economic history. It seems to me that the challenge today, it appears, because the facts aren't all in yet, that the pace of change and the pace of dislocation is much more rapid, and the ability of governments who are often ossified or caught up with sclerosis of one kind or another, the ability of governments to respond is less than it might have been at another time. And so people are losing their jobs to AI, and there isn't an effective response, or maybe there isn't one possible. So the question is more focused than the big sweep of history.
Let me give you one example. When we built the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, it used to take 6 weeks to 6 months to get goods from the West Coast to the East Coast. With the Transcontinental Railroad, it took 6 days. Enormously disruptive to the established ossified interests and to government as it then saw the ability to govern shipping and so on. So, personally, I don't think anything is new. It may be a rapid speed, but relative to the way things changed in those days, that was an enormously rapid transition.
Didn't they say that Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones?
It's true.
So what's new?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm happy to see such an optimistic group coming from the top-down perspective. Let's see. Any quick thought, or your?
I was going to say, one of the issues you have with digital, if you're putting together a government or any policy around digital change, it's rather like you can't push back the tide. It's like trying to fight gravity. The thing a sensible government has to do is try to work out how to get the best for its citizens, given that that's happening.
Right.
I think some of the tenor of what has been coming across has been that, oh, we can stop this. I don't think governments are in a position to stop the enormous disruption that's happening to industry. Because
let me just to show you the tenor of what people in the audience are asking. In big red letters at the top of my iPad, it's, if you had absolute control, how would you regulate AI as a policymaker, right? And so, I mean, that's a nice thought exercise, but we're hearing from people in that position, we don't have absolute control. These are global companies. We have national sovereignty, right? So in a sense, we have to find new means of coping and more nimble ways of dealing with this that are probably going to require good behavior from the actors themselves and market dynamics over time, is what I'm hearing from my panelists in response to the understandable frustration.
Yeah, a sustainable approach to this involves that.
Right.
You know, just going around and shin-kicking the tech companies isn't really going to help anybody.
Right. Let's get a question from the floor. Do we have anybody who is dying to ask a question of our panel of worthies on stage? Something that you haven't seen discussed thus far, perhaps, or putting a sharper point on one of the questions. I'll give you a moment to think about this, and also I should alert our microphone runners. Please get ready to come out. If AI is like electricity, why don't we regulate AI GenCos? Is a question that's come in from the floor.
GenCos?
The argument about regulated utilities, right? What do you think? Does anyone have any appetite for that? Anybody think that's a good idea?
I think there's definitely or certainly people would like us to be able to be in a position where we could regulate the way that AI works to demonstrate fairness. I mean, ultimately, even as the way government works now, you want to have systems that work and enable people to see the workings behind a decision.
Right.
The issue with AI is you won't be able to see the workings behind the decision. And so we've got to approach that in a completely different way. And I'll be really open and say we haven't got to that stage yet. We are learning at that point.
Google, Alibaba, Facebook make huge revenue gains off data collected off of consumers. Should consumers be given a percentage of that income?
I think one of the...
I'll take it.
I think there is a shift, definitely, towards what Doc Searls would refer to as vendor relationship management. That is where we're changing the relationship between companies owning all the data on people and people actually starting to own the data on themselves and being able to drive the market in that way. And I think that's one of the reforms that, certainly if you look at what the European Union are doing at the moment, that's a really interesting move. And there's certainly a move towards the ownership of data and data coming as a fifth freedom. That's one of the components behind that, and particularly behind the Estonian presidency at the moment for that.
But you know, this issue of big data, again, as the previous participants in this panel mentioned, you can structure them to ensure anonymity. The interesting question would be, in answer to your question, is what would you prefer as an audience? To have private companies have your data, or to have governments own all your data?
Yeah.
That's 1984.
Yeah, I used to ask students when I was teaching, what's the who do you trust more, Google or the government? That's a really interesting. Well, actually, the best students always said the government, actually, because it was the more difficult case to answer and to argue. Most people came in and said Google, actually, because it was more open, and I think that's one of the things where governments have fundamentally, up until the last 5 years, not been transparent about what they do. And the growth of more transparency in government is now a really helpful mode in engaging in trust with citizens. And
as Isha was saying, this is a powerful trend.
And it's not just the sort of transparency as an anti-corruption thing. It's operational transparency changes the entire behaviour of the way the government machine works. I remember once we had to try and cut energy usage by 25% almost overnight. And you could do that two ways. One, you could run around and tell everyone to turn the lights off. I published all the energy usage in the buildings of that administration and put the email address of the person who was in charge of it on the web page, and we went down 25% overnight. Right. You know, you can use transparency to help people make the right decision.
This is actually happening in some states in India where, you know, the municipal administration department is getting the municipalities and city governments to just post all the data on their performance. And they find as a result that there is distinct improvement because there is this sense of competition and that you're being watched. So I agree, transparency and accountability closer to where the action is, along with building capacity. Because what is often argued in India is that you can bring accountability closer to the user of public service, but these people don't know how to work. But then you have to help build their capacity. If you can do these three things, build capacity, ask for accountability and have transparency with a clear financial empowerment, I think it's no rocket science. You could improve the functioning of these cities within months, not just years. But these are not easy things to do. These are challenging things to do.
They're hard to do, but together they could have a very powerful impact.
Yeah, I mean, just if you were running any web organization and you had to check how people used your services, when we started publishing that in the UK, of how people were using the services and how many people were doing it, it identified the way of how you change the delivery of the service so that people could then actually start using the online service more. And that was the whole idea behind having a digital by default approach, was to design things that people use more. I know that sounds really basic, but it was only through being transparent about it that the change actually started to happen.
And it can even enable greater things, right? I mean, when you start with user-centered design, or in the case of government, citizen-centered, it's not only that the workings of the government itself are more transparent, but you begin to enable things like crowdsourcing of ideas, of open innovation platforms. There are lots of examples of how the 1 + 1 can equal 5 in this area, and that's for those of you who are interested, you can read a book called Need, Speed, and Greed, written by one Vijay Vaitiswaran, available at good bookstores near you, about the future of global innovation. But here are the practitioners who are actually doing it. I did promise my audience the chance, unless you're stunned by the brilliance of our experts and you have no questions at all, or prefer to hide in the veil of anonymity provided by the iPad. Yes, I think I see someone pointing there to look here. Great. Yes, thank you, sir. Let's get a microphone to the gentleman.
Well, somebody just said data is like electricity. I actually think that's not a good analogy. I think data is going to be like air, which means you can't control it. You can't say this is mine and I block it off. But as a consequence, I do think that the answer is in something Liam actually started off with. We're going to have to define the new rules for a new society, new rules for a new social order. And I don't think it's about regulation. I think it's about involving from the bottom of the society at large to define provenance, context, and use. It's a long comment, but I think of data, controlling data and AI, sort of like controlling a knife is controlling a gun. Gun you can regulate. I have licensing. A knife, I use it to cut fruit, I'm okay. I use it to stab my neighbor, I'm not. So it's really context and use.
Right.
I think defining context and use for data and AI is going to be the most important challenge for our times. And the question I have for you, Liam, particularly, is your experiment. You had the great thing about genetically modified food versus the other stuff. What is our experience in actually being able to shape rules for society? And actually, the related point, I often wonder whether a place like Singapore, city-state, 5 million people cutting into technology, is that something we could actually be a good social lab for?
Yes, to answer your last point, yes, you can have a
and
great...
it's beginning to be already, of course.
Yeah,
I think
it is.
In fairness, Singapore has a lot of experiments in play on this.
And I think the use of the lab environment is actually one of the most useful ways of working in this, is that you have to try... that you can't design and build everything and then go and make it. So the solutions that we have in this space are not like a bridge or like a huge building. You have to design and work with people and see how it works in a lab condition. And yes, having a city and a city state that wants to work as a lab is tremendously empowering for technologies, and it's particularly one of the reasons why a smart city approach is very interesting here. But actually, think about where a smart city approach is somewhere like I was in Sao Paulo earlier, and where you could change people's lives by encouraging them to by reducing the time people take to go to work, by unclogging the traffic. That's something which is which a lab like Singapore trying out smart cities can help us try and understand, so we can apply it somewhere else. And I think that's the approach. one thing I would like to say just about trying it out in different governments is, as governments, the one great thing we have, and we haven't really touched on this, is we don't compete. We have no competition with Singapore, the UK. I mean, we have no desire to open a driving license service in Singapore and issue driving licenses.
Your companies compete, but as you said,
governments, we don't.
Servants, there's no competition for you.
But we could open a driving license service, but there would be no point but we do exactly the same thing.
Right.
And that's why the ability for governments to work together is actually it's not one of those waffly things. We now do it really clearly, and we have a group which does that. And I think the use of a sandbox idea for government is tremendously helpful.
But the sandbox idea, this gets to one important way to think about regulatory innovation, right, and dealing with fast-moving areas. Fintech is an area, financial technologies, where Singapore has a sandbox approach.
So do we.
And so does London, of course, the city of London, one of the great hubs of fintech. I've spent the last 5 years in Shanghai as my magazine's China business editor. And what I've seen is culture varies. And in China, which arguably is at the cutting edge of fintech, we saw Joe from Alibaba, actually their private sector arm, or the privately held arm, Ant Financial, is the Goliath of fintech at the moment in the world, and doing some very innovative things along with their rival WeChat and Tencent. It's not a sandbox in China. It's more like a Gobi Desert. In other words, the companies are allowed to experiment in extremely wild, woolly ways. And I've written lots on our pages about how many of these are inventions, business models that are at the cutting edge, that are better than what you can find coming out of Silicon Valley, more inventive, more user-focused, and they're moving faster. But at the same time, you have a stronger regulator who's waiting, giving permission, but can come at any time and set down the laws, and sometimes retroactively. And they've done this with peer-to-peer lending that went wrong into Ponzi schemes and so on. So different countries will respond based on cultural norms, the strength of the government, as well as expectations of society, a free market ethos versus maybe collectivist. And I think we're seeing already a bit of a competition in that sense, not with each other, but in terms of models, to see which produces better outcomes. And so I'm personally left encouraged by some of the comments that our experts have made. I think we're almost out of time. I'll give one last chance for a courageous comment from the floor or a challenge before I wrap up our session. I think actually that speaks very well to our speakers. I think we did a great job of looking at the question, a very challenging topic. We're not going to have the last word here today. But when we looked at that question that I posed earlier, how do we go from stagnation to rejuvenation? I think you've given us some great hope that the path lies in innovation, including in governance. Please give my panelists a nice round of applause. This concludes this session.